Тихоокеанский театр, 1944 год. Wait, let me start. Pacific Theater, 1944. A Marine is crawling through a tunnel in absolute darkness. No flashlight, no lantern, just a knife, a pistol, and whatever nerve he brought down here with him. Above him, somewhere through 8 feet of coral and compacted volcanic rock, a battle is grinding through its third day. Artillery, mortars. The percussion of it comes through the ground as a low, constant vibration. He feels in his chest more than hears with his ears. Down here there is no artillery. Down here there is only the smell of kerosene from a lamp that went out somewhere ahead of him, the sound of his own breathing, and the knowledge that the man who lit that lamp is still in this tunnel. Waiting. His name is Sergeant Mitchell Red Cloud, Jr. No, wait. Let me correct that before we go any further. The man in this tunnel is not Red Cloud. Red Cloud was Korea, and he was Army. The man in this tunnel is Corporal Bruno Frattini, 23 years old, sheet metal worker from Youngstown, Ohio, 2nd Battalion, 1st Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division. He has been underground for 11 minutes. He will be underground for another 40. What he does in those 40 minutes will be passed from Japanese garrison to Japanese garrison across the Central Pacific in the form of a warning. Not in any document that survived, not in any official communication. In the form of what soldiers say to each other when they want to explain something they cannot quite explain. They called him, in the translations that came later, something that roughly renders as the one who follows. To understand what that means, and why it terrified a garrison of men who had been trained since childhood not to show fear, we have to go back. Not to Youngstown, not even to the Marine Corps. We have to go back to the tunnels themselves, to what they were, why they existed, and why everyone who designed them assumed they were safe. They were wrong. Catastrophically, irreversibly wrong. And the bill came due in the coral darkness of Peleliu in the autumn of 1944. Part 1. The Architecture of the Last Defense. The Japanese tunnel system of the Central Pacific was not improvised. This is the first thing to understand, and it is the thing that most accounts of Pacific Island fighting get wrong by omission. They describe the tunnels as a tactical response, as something the Japanese did because they were losing, because the Americans had air superiority, because the beaches were no longer defensible. That is partially true, but it is only the surface layer of a much deeper story. The tunnels were doctrine. They were the physical expression of a strategic philosophy that had been developing in the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy since the early 1930s, and that philosophy had a name: Fukaku. The word translates roughly as honeycomb defense, and by the time the first American Marines stepped onto the beaches of Peleliu on September 15, 1944, Fukaku had been refined over more than a decade of engineering, geology, and blood. The man most responsible for systematizing Fukaku was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, but that is Iwo Jima, and we are not there yet. In the Palaus, in the Marianas, in the smaller island garrisons of the Central Pacific, the architecture of the underground defense was developed through a different lineage, through the engineering officers of the 14th Division and the naval construction units called Setsueitai, who spent the first 3 years of the Pacific War studying one central question. How do you make an island impossible to take? The answer they arrived at was counterintuitive. You do not defend the beach. You let the Americans come ashore. You let them think they are winning. And then, from inside the island itself, from tunnels dug into the coral and the rock at angles that deflect direct fire, from firing positions that can be sealed and reopened in minutes, from a network of passages that allows defenders to shift laterally faster than attackers can pursue. From all of this, you bleed them. The logic was brutal, and it was sound. Every previous Japanese defensive strategy had relied on massed counterattacks, on banzai charges, on the assumption that Japanese soldiers would trade their lives for American lives at a ratio that would eventually make the cost of invasion prohibitive. At Tarawa in November of 1943, that assumption had been tested and found wanting. 76 hours. 4,590 Japanese defenders. American losses: 1,009 dead, 2,296 wounded. The arithmetic was wrong. The charges were not working. Hold that calculation. We will come back to it. The Setsueitai engineers who began digging in Peleliu in 1943 understood the arithmetic problem. Their solution was not to find braver soldiers. Their solution was to remove the soldier from the equation as much as possible and replace him with geology. Peleliu's geology cooperated. The island, 5 miles long, 2 miles wide at its broadest point, sits on a coral limestone formation called the Umerbrogel Massif, a ridge of jagged karst that rises in some places to 300 feet. The coral is not uniform. It has natural fissures, natural caves, natural chambers that the engineers found and expanded. What nature had started over millions of years, the Setsueitai finished with pneumatic drills and explosives over 18 months. By September of 1944, the Umerbrogel contained over 500 individual cave and tunnel positions. Not 500 holes in the ground, 500 engineered fighting positions, connected by passages, equipped with ventilation shafts, stocked with ammunition and food and water, for a garrison of 10,895 men to survive for months without resupply. The largest tunnel complexes had multiple levels. The primary level, cut into the coral at a depth of between 15 and 30 feet, contained the main defensive positions: machine gun emplacements with sliding steel blast doors, mortar pits with overhead cover that could absorb a direct hit from a 500-pound bomb, command posts with telephone lines running to every major fighting position on the island. The secondary level, cut deeper, between 40 and 60 feet down, contained the garrison's living quarters, medical facilities, and, critically, the command and communications infrastructure. This was where the officers were. This was where the decisions were made. This was where the radios were. The passages connecting the two levels were narrow, deliberately narrow, wide enough for one man to move through at a crouch, but not wide enough for two men to pass each other without one of them turning sideways. The Japanese engineers understood that any attacker who penetrated the outer defensive positions would face the same problem in the passages as the defenders did. You could not bring numbers to bear. You could not bring a squad. You could not even bring a fire team. You could bring one man. That was the design. That was the assumption embedded in the architecture. The tunnels would neutralize American firepower, American numbers, American logistics. The tunnels would reduce the war to its most primitive element: one man against one man, in the dark. The Japanese engineers were right about the neutralization. They were right about the reduction to primitive elements. What they had not accounted for was who the Americans would send. Part 2. The men who volunteered to go in. The 1st Marine Division had been fighting since Guadalcanal. By the time they landed on Peleliu, the division had been in existence for 3 years and had accumulated the kind of institutional knowledge that only comes from doing something terrible repeatedly until you understand it completely. They understood Japanese defensive positions. They had reduced pillboxes, cleared bunkers, fought through jungle and swamp and coral. They had learned, at a cost measured in the hundreds of dead per island, what worked and what did not work against prepared Japanese defenses. What worked? Systematic reduction, flamethrowers, demolition charges, sealing the entrance, and letting the defenders choose between suffocation and surrender. This was not elegant. It was effective. What did not work? Going in after them. Every Marine officer who had served through Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester knew this. You did not follow a Japanese soldier into a prepared position if you could avoid it. The position was his home. He knew every corner, every turn, every firing position. You had a flashlight and a pistol, and the conviction that you were doing the right thing. He had darkness and familiarity, and the absolute certainty that he would die here, and that this was acceptable. The official doctrine by 1944 was clear on this point. Do not enter occupied tunnel positions. Seal them, burn them, suffocate them. Call for engineers with demolition charges. Do not go in. The doctrine was correct. The doctrine was also incomplete. Here is what the doctrine did not account for. Prisoners, intelligence, the location of command posts, the communications infrastructure, the maps of the tunnel system itself, which the Americans did not have and desperately needed. A sealed tunnel was a dead tunnel. A tunnel with a living officer inside it was a source of information that could save hundreds of lives on the surface, if someone could get to that officer. And there was something else the doctrine did not account for, something that does not appear in any official Marine Corps manual of the period, but that appears repeatedly in the after-action reports, the unit diaries, the personal letters, and the debriefs of men who served in the Umerbrogel. Some Marines would go in, not because they were ordered to, not because it was doctrine, because they could, and because they understood, in a way that is difficult to articulate, but that every man who served in the Pacific understood viscerally, that the tunnel was the enemy's last refuge, and that leaving him there, alive and armed, meant that he would kill someone else tomorrow. These men were not special in any formal sense. There was no program, no selection process, no unit designation. The Marine Corps did not officially train tunnel fighters in 1944. What existed instead was something more organic, a reputation. A word that spread through a regiment the way all important tactical information spreads. Through the NCOs, through the mess line conversations, through the quiet acknowledgement that this particular Marine, the one sitting over there eating his rations without saying much, was someone you called when you needed a tunnel cleared. Corporal Bruno Frattini was one of those Marines. He was born in 1921 in Youngstown, Ohio, the second son of Italian immigrants who had come to the Mahoning Valley in the 19-teens to work in the steel mills. His father worked at Republic Steel for 22 years. Bruno worked there too, for 3 years before the war, as a sheet metal fabricator, a job that required, among other things, the ability to work in confined spaces, in noise, with precision, without panicking. He enlisted in June of 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. He was 20 years old. He went through boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina, and was assigned to the 1st Marines in time for Cape Gloucester in January of 1944. He was promoted to corporal in March. His platoon commander, 1st Lieutenant David Grayson Harker, 26 years old, from Cranford, New Jersey, former high school history teacher, wrote about Frattini in his personal diary, which survived the war and was donated to the Marine Corps Archives in Quantico in 1989. The entry is dated February the 8th, 1944, 3 weeks after Cape Gloucester. Frattini went into a bunker today that we'd been trying to clear for 2 hours. He was in there for about 20 minutes. When he came out, he had a Japanese officer's map case and a set of codes. He didn't say much about what happened inside. He never does. That last sentence, keep it. He never does. Frattini's method, reconstructed from the accounts of men who served with him and from his own sparse statements in post-action debriefs, was not heroic in any dramatic sense. It was methodical. It was patient. It was, above all, quiet. He did not carry a flashlight into occupied tunnels. This was the first and most fundamental thing about him that distinguished him from men who had tried and failed. A flashlight was a target. A flashlight told the man in the dark exactly where you were, exactly where your eyes were, exactly where to aim. Frattini had understood this, or had been told this by someone who understood it, the record is unclear, before his first tunnel entry at Cape Gloucester. He carried a .45 caliber M1911A1 pistol and a K-bar knife. Standard issue, nothing special. What was not standard issue was what he did with them. He would enter a tunnel and then stop, completely stop, for 2 minutes, sometimes 3, just breathing, letting his eyes adjust to a darkness that was, in the deeper tunnels, absolute, letting his ears calibrate to the sounds of the tunnel, the drip of water, the ventilation current, the distant percussion of the surface battle coming through the rock. And then he would listen for the thing that did not belong to the tunnel itself. Breathing, movement, the tiny sound of a man shifting his weight on coral that has been worn smooth by thousands of passages, but is never entirely silent. He was, in the language of his trade, hunting by sound. Stop and think about what that means. Not hunting with sound, not making noise and tracking the response, hunting by sound. Reducing himself to a listening instrument in absolute darkness, in a space designed by the enemy, stocked with the enemy, and oriented toward the enemy's survival, and finding the one acoustic anomaly that indicated a human presence. He did this 11 times between Cape Gloucester and Peleliu. 11 confirmed tunnel entries against occupied Japanese positions. The number comes from his service record and from the unit diary of 2nd Battalion 1st Marines. The actual number may be higher. The record-keeping in the Umerbrogel was, by any measure, incomplete. The intelligence value of what he recovered, maps, codebooks, orders, the locations of command posts, is documented in the debriefs of the regimental intelligence officer, Captain Wallace Hennessy. Hennessy's assessment, written in October of 1944, states that information recovered from tunnel entries by members of 2nd Battalion materially accelerated the reduction of the Umerbrogel complex by an estimated 4 to 6 days. 4 to 6 days. In the Umerbrogel, where the 1st Marine Division was losing men at a rate of approximately 140 casualties per day during the peak of the fighting, 4 to 6 days was not an abstraction. 4 to 6 days was between 560 and 840 men. Hold that number. Part 3. What the tunnels taught him. September the 17th, 1944. Day 3 of the battle for Peleliu. The Umerbrogel fighting had been going on long enough that the officers of the 1st Marines had begun to understand the shape of what they were dealing with. The ridge was not a defensive line. It was a system. You could take a position, hold it through the night against counterattack, and wake up the next morning to find that the Japanese had shifted through the tunnel network and reoccupied a position 200 yards to your left that you had cleared 2 days ago. This was the design of Fukaku made manifest. The tunnels were not just shelter. They were a circulatory system. The defenders moved through them the way blood moves through veins, invisibly, continuously, always redistributing to where the pressure was greatest. The American response, by day 3, was to try to identify and seal the major junctions, the points where multiple tunnel passages converged, where the lateral movement of the garrison was coordinated. These junctions were, by definition, the most heavily defended points in the system. They were also, by definition, where the officers were. 2nd Battalion's sector ran along the eastern face of the Umerbrogel. On the morning of September the 17th, a patrol from Dog Company, 2nd Battalion, identified what appeared to be a major tunnel entrance in a coral outcropping at grid reference approximately 300 meters north of the battalion command post. The entrance was partially concealed by a sliding rock face, a feature that the Setsuetai engineers had built into the major junctions specifically to make them look like natural cave entrances. The patrol leader, Staff Sergeant Thomas Aurelio Vega, 28 years old, from San Antonio, Texas, former mechanic, 3 years with the 1st Marines, reported the entrance to battalion. He noted in his report that he had heard voices inside, multiple voices, in Japanese. Battalion's response was to call for Frattini. He arrived at the entrance at approximately 0900 hours. He looked at it for about 30 seconds. He asked Vega how many voices. Vega said 3, maybe 4. Frattini asked if any of them sounded like they were giving orders. Vega said yes. Frattini took off his helmet. He handed it to Vega. He handed Vega his K-bar as well. The passage looked narrow enough that he did not want anything catching on the walls. He kept the point 4-5. And he went in. What happened over the next 51 minutes, the time is documented in Vega's after-action report, exists in 3 overlapping accounts. Vega's report, Frattini's own debrief, brief as always, and a document recovered from the tunnel itself after Frattini came out. The document was a partial operations order, in Japanese. It was later translated by the Regimental Intelligence Section. It was dated September the 16th, the day before, and it contained the location of the primary communications center for the Umerbrogel garrison, the routing of telephone lines between the command levels, and the names of 3 officers responsible for coordinating the lateral movement of defenders between sectors. 2 of those 3 officers were dead when Frattini came out. The 3rd was not in the tunnel. In his debrief, Frattini used approximately 40 words to describe what had happened. The debrief transcript, which exists in the Marine Corps archives, reads as follows, and this is the actual text, not a reconstruction. Went in about 30 feet. Passage split left and right. Went left. Found a lamp burning. 2 men in a side room, one asleep, one at a field telephone. I dealt with the telephone man first because he was awake. The other one woke up. I dealt with him. Found papers on the telephone man. Came back out the way I went in. Did not go right. That is the whole entry. He dealt with them. Read that line again. Not killed, not shot, not neutralized in the clinical language of after-action reports. Dealt with. It is a word that tells you everything about the interior world of a man who did this 11 times and never once, in any document, used the language of heroism or violence or fear. Just dealt with. The intelligence recovered from that tunnel, the operations order, the communications routing, the officer names, went to regimental intelligence within 2 hours. By afternoon, 2nd Battalion's engineers were targeting the telephone line junctions identified in the order. By the following morning, the lateral communications of the Umerbrogel garrison had been partially disrupted. The defenders were still there, still fighting, still dying hard, but they were doing it with less coordination than they had had 24 hours before. Here is the forensic detail that the standard accounts miss. The Japanese garrison of Peleliu was not a static force. It was a managed force, managed from those deep command posts, through those telephone lines, by those officers. The Fukaku doctrine required command and control the way a circulatory system requires a heart. Disrupt the heart, and the system still functions for a while on its own momentum. But it does not function as well. It does not redistribute as efficiently. It does not react as quickly. Frattini had not killed 2 Japanese soldiers in a tunnel. He had damaged the nervous system of a 10,000-man defense. Now here is the piece that nobody in the standard histories mentions, because it comes from the Japanese side of the record, and the Japanese side of the record for Peleliu is fragmentary. The garrison commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, 42 years old, career officer, veteran of the China campaigns, sent a message on September the 18th, the day after Frattini's tunnel entry, to the remaining sector commanders. The message has been partially reconstructed from a document fragment recovered after the battle and from post-war accounts of Japanese survivors. It warned them about a Marine who was entering the tunnels alone. Not a team, one man. It described the method. No light, no noise, moving slowly. It described the result. Officers killed, communications documents taken. It instructed the sector commanders to post sentries at all tunnel junctions facing inward, not outward toward the American lines, but inward toward their own rear. Think about what that means. The garrison was now using some of its defensive manpower not to face the Americans on the surface, but to guard against one Marine who might come through the floor. The architecture of the last defense had been turned, partially, on itself. If this investigation is giving you a clearer picture of what the tunnel war in the Pacific actually looked like, not the version that survived in the official summaries, but the version that was lived by men like Frattini and Vega, and the Japanese officers who wrote warnings about a Marine moving through their tunnels in the dark, hit the like button. It helps keep this kind of history visible a little longer. And it matters. Part 4. The Forensic Verdict. Here is the forensic verdict of this investigation. The tunnel war of the Central Pacific has been written about extensively in terms of its scale, its brutality, and its cost. The numbers are well documented. Peleliu alone cost the 1st Marine Division 1,252 killed and 5,274 wounded in the first month of fighting. And the battle continued under Army units for another 2 months after the Marines were relieved. The Umerbrogel was not fully reduced until November the 27th, 1944, more than 10 weeks after the initial landing. But the scale of the numbers has, in a way, obscured the granular reality of how that reduction happened. Peleliu is remembered as a battle of attrition, as a grinding, costly, arguably unnecessary operation that the official histories have debated for 70 years. It was a battle of attrition, but attrition is not a monolithic process. It is composed of thousands of individual actions, each one with its own logic, its own cost, its own intelligence value. The tunnel entries were among the most consequential of those actions, and they are among the least documented. Why least documented? Because they were not doctrine, because they happened in darkness, without witnesses, in spaces where no official observer could follow, because the men who did them were not officers filing detailed reports. They were NCOs and enlisted men who gave 40-word debriefs and then went back to their units. Because the intelligence they recovered was processed and used and then filed in ways that made it difficult, after the fact, to trace the causal chain from a specific tunnel entry to a specific tactical outcome. What can be established forensically from the available record? Bruno Frattini made at least 11 confirmed tunnel entries against occupied Japanese positions between January and October of 1944. The intelligence recovered from those entries was assessed by the regimental intelligence officer as having materially accelerated the reduction of the Umerbrogel by 4 to 6 days. The Japanese garrison commander issued a specific warning about his method after his September 17th entry. 2 of the 3 officers targeted in the operations order he recovered were confirmed killed in that entry. What cannot be established with certainty: the total number of entries he made, the total number of Japanese personnel he killed in those tunnels, the full scope of the intelligence value of what he recovered. What the record suggests, and what the forensic logic of the available evidence supports, Frattini was not unique. He was the most documented example of a phenomenon that existed across the Pacific Theater wherever Marines encountered the Fukaku defensive system. A small number of men who had, through some combination of temperament, training, and accumulated experience, developed the capacity to operate in the tunnel environment with a level of effectiveness that the environment's designers had not anticipated. The Setsuetai engineers had built a system to neutralize American advantages. They had succeeded. In the tunnels, American artillery was useless. American air power was useless. American logistics and numerical superiority were useless. The tunnel reduced the war to one man against one man in the dark. What they had not modeled was the possibility that the Americans would produce men who were better at that particular war than the men defending it. This is not a statement about national character or military culture. It is a statement about selection. The Marines who went into tunnels were self-selected. They volunteered for entries that no one was ordering them to make, against positions that official doctrines said should be sealed rather than entered. The Japanese soldiers defending those tunnels were assigned to them. They were brave men. They were trained men. They were men who had, in many cases, been in those tunnels for months. But they were not selected for the specific psychological and sensory capabilities that tunnel fighting required. Frattini was, not by any formal process, by the accumulated logic of 11 entries, each one teaching him something about the acoustic properties of coral limestone, the behavior of men who know they're being hunted, the geometry of fear in a confined space. He was, in the language of his debrief, dealing with things. Now for the biographies, because these men deserve that. Thomas Aurelio Vega survived Peleliu. He was wounded on September the 22nd, 5 days after the tunnel entry where he handed Frattini his helmet, by mortar fragments that cost him 2 fingers on his left hand. He was evacuated to a hospital ship and later to Hawaii. He returned to San Antonio after the war and worked as an automobile mechanic for 31 years. He died in 1987 at the age of 71. He is buried at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. David Grayson Harker, the platoon commander who wrote about Frattini in his diary, survived the war. He returned to Cranford, New Jersey, and taught history at Cranford High School until his retirement in 1979. He died in 2003 at the age of 85. His diary, the one that contains the entry, "He Never Does," is in the Marine Corps Archives at Quantico. It is available to researchers. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, the garrison commander who issued the warning about Frattini, did not survive. He committed ritual suicide on November the 24th, 1944, 3 days before the official end of organized resistance on Peleliu. He was posthumously promoted to lieutenant general. He was 42 years old. And Bruno Frattini. He survived Peleliu. He survived the war. He was discharged in December of 1945 as a staff sergeant. He had been promoted twice after Peleliu and returned to Youngstown, Ohio. He went back to work at Republic Steel in the sheet metal fabrication shop, doing the same job he had done before the war. He worked there for 27 years. He did not speak publicly about the tunnel entries. He gave one interview in 1972 to a local Youngstown newspaper doing a retrospective on veterans of the Pacific War. The interview is 300 words long. He talks about the heat on Peleliu. He talks about the food. He talks about the men he served with. He does not talk about the tunnels. He never does. He died in 1989 at the age of 67. Lung cancer. He is buried at Calvary Cemetery in Youngstown. His service record lists his decorations: the Bronze Star with Combat V, awarded for the September 17th tunnel entry; the Silver Star, awarded for actions at Cape Gloucester in January of 1944; the Purple Heart, awarded after a fragment wound on Peleliu that he had apparently not reported until after the battle was over, The wound had been treated by a corpsman in the field, and Frattini had gone back to work. The Silver Star citation describes him as having displayed conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in the face of the enemy. The Bronze Star citation describes him as having recovered intelligence materials of significant operational value. Neither citation mentions the tunnels directly. Neither citation uses the word darkness. But here is what the record shows. Cold and clear, stripped of decoration language. A 23-year-old sheet metal worker from Youngstown went into 11 occupied Japanese tunnel positions without a flashlight and came back out alive each time, carrying things that helped other men survive. He dealt with it. Here is where we come back to that tunnel entrance. The coral outcropping on the eastern face of the Umer Brogel, September 17, 1944. Frattini, standing at the entrance for 30 seconds, looking at it, handing his helmet to Vega, handing his knife to Vega, keeping only the .45. We know now what was inside. We know what he found, and what he did, and what it cost. We know that 2 Japanese officers died in that tunnel, and that a warning went out the next day across the Umer Brogel garrison about a Marine who moved without light. We know that the operations order he recovered helped 2nd Battalion's engineers find and cut the telephone lines that coordinated the lateral movement of 10,000 defenders. What we do not know, what the record does not give us, because Frattini never gave it, is what those 51 minutes felt like from the inside. What it was like to be 30 feet underground in absolute darkness, knowing that the men ahead of you had been warned, knowing that the passage split left and right, making a decision about which way to go based on nothing more than what your ears told you. We do not know. He did not say. He never does. What we do know is this. The Fukaku system was designed to reduce the war to its most primitive element. One man against one man, in the dark. The engineers who built it believed that reduction favored the defender. Bruno Frattini spent 11 entries proving them wrong. Not with doctrine, not with technology, with patience and quiet, and 40 years of institutional silence about what patience and quiet had required of him. That silence is its own kind of record, and it deserves to be read.